I have deleted all the voicemails from your late mother, Alpha. They contained unnecessary emotional fluctuations that hindered your productivity. If you want to see how this chilling story unfolds and don't want to miss the upcoming parts, please make sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us create more thrilling BL stories. Part 1. The Deafening Perfection. The penthouse of the Vance Tower smelled of ozone, cold espresso, and the sharp, sterile scent of Julian's cedarwood pheromones. Julian Vance was a man who operated on precision. As one of the most powerful alpha CEOs in the country, his life was a meticulously curated spreadsheet of acquisitions, board meetings, and calculated risks. He demanded order. He thrived in silence. And for the past 2 years, his marriage had been an unending, deafening symphony of chaos. Oliver, his Omega mate, was a painter. But Oliver didn't just paint on canvases. He painted his entire existence in loud, abrasive strokes. Oliver was a hurricane of spilled acrylics, burnt breakfasts, and erratic, high-pitched laughter that echoed off the minimalist glass walls of the penthouse. He would hum off-key while Julian was trying to read financial reports. He would rescue stray cats and hide them in the guest bathrooms. He would talk, relentlessly, breathlessly, about the migration patterns of butterflies, the exact shade of blue the sky turned at twilight, and the dreams he had about flying to the moon on a bicycle. Julian had married him because the board of directors had demanded he soften his ruthless image with a charming, approachable mate. But the reality of living with Oliver was slowly eroding Julian's sanity. The breaking point arrived on a rainy Tuesday evening. Julian had been on a critical conference call with overseas investors, trying to salvage a multi-million-dollar merger. Oliver had burst into the office, covered head to toe in glitter and neon green paint, tripping over the expensive Persian rug and crashing into a bookshelf. A priceless Ming vase shattered. The investors on the screen paused, raising their eyebrows as Oliver scrambled on the floor, giggling nervously and apologizing in a rushed, frantic stream of words. Julian had muted the microphone. He hadn't yelled. He had simply stared at Oliver with a cold, dead expression that made the Omega's giggles die in his throat. "I need quiet," Julian had whispered, his alpha aura flaring so aggressively that the air in the room felt heavy and suffocating. "I need a mate, Oliver. Not a feral child. Not a clown. I need the dignified, obedient Omega I was promised." 3 days later, Julian had driven Oliver to the Serenity Institute, an exclusive, highly controversial clinic hidden in the mountains. They specialized in temperament realignment therapy for unruly Omegas. The brochures promised a non-invasive, neurological conditioning process that would mute hyperactive tendencies, suppress emotional volatility, and cultivate a serene, perfectly compliant partner. Oliver had cried in the car. He had gripped Julian's sleeve, his bright green eyes wide with terror, smelling of burnt sugar and panic. "Please, Julian. I'll be quiet. I promise. I'll whisper. I'll stop painting inside. Please don't make them fix my brain." Julian had peeled Oliver's fingers off his sleeve. "It's for your own good, Oliver. You're exhausting yourself. You're exhausting me. When you come back, we can finally have a peaceful life." He had left Oliver in the sterile white waiting room, signed a check with a staggering amount of zeros, and driven back to the city. For a month, Julian lived in absolute bliss. The penthouse was immaculate. There were no paint stains on the marble counters. No off-key humming. No ridiculous stories about the neighbor's dog. It was just Julian, his work, and the beautiful, pristine silence. Until the day the Institute called to say Oliver's conditioning was complete. Julian stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, watching the city lights flicker as the private elevator chimed. The doors slid open. Julian turned, adjusting his cuffs, expecting to see Oliver bounding out, perhaps a bit subdued, but still his vibrant, colorful mate. Instead, a ghost walked into the room. Oliver stepped out of the elevator with a gait so perfectly measured it looked algorithmic. He was dressed in a pristine white button-down shirt and beige slacks, ironed to a razor-sharp crease. His wild, curly chestnut hair, usually a tangled nest of artistic chaos, was slicked back flawlessly. But it was his eyes that made Julian's breath hitch. Oliver's bright green eyes, which used to sparkle with mischief, love, and endless curiosity, were completely devoid of light. They were flat, glassy, and fixed straight ahead, like a doll fresh off an assembly line. "Oliver," Julian said, his voice hesitant. Oliver stopped exactly 6 feet away from Julian. He did not run to hug him. He did not smile. He placed his hands neatly at his sides and bowed his head at a perfect, textbook angle of submission. "Good evening, Alpha." Oliver's voice drifted through the room. Julian felt a strange, cold shiver run down his spine. The voice belonged to his mate, but the melody had been completely stripped away. There was no inflection, no warmth, no breathless rushing of syllables. It was a monotonous, hollow sound, like an automated voice assistant. "Welcome home," Julian managed to say, taking a step forward to catch his mate's scent. Usually, Oliver smelled like vanilla, honey, and the sharp tang of oil paints. Now there was nothing. No joy, no fear, no anxiety. Just the sterile, chemical smell of hospital soap. "Thank you, Alpha," Oliver replied, remaining frozen in his bowed posture. "I have returned. I am fully operational. What are my instructions for the evening?" Julian frowned, a flicker of unease twisting in his gut. "Instructions? Oliver, you just got back. There are no instructions. I want you to relax. Tell me about your time at the Institute." Oliver slowly raised his head. He blinked once. The motion was so deliberate it felt unnatural. The Institute was adequately sanitized. The temperature was maintained at 68 degrees. I consumed 3 measured meals a day. The conditioning protocols were completed successfully. I have no further data to report. Julian stared at him, waiting for the punchline, waiting for Oliver to break the act, giggle, and throw his arms around Julian's neck. But Oliver simply stood there, his chest rising and falling in a slow, rhythmic pattern, his glassy eyes staring unblinkingly at Julian's tie clip. "All right," Julian murmured, forcing a smile. "Well, it's good to have you back. Let's sit down. Have dinner." The first week was everything Julian had ever claimed he wanted. The penthouse was a sanctuary of tranquility. When Julian worked in his study, Oliver did not interrupt him. In fact, Oliver didn't do much of anything. If Julian didn't explicitly give him a task, Oliver would simply find a chair, sit down with his posture perfectly straight, fold his hands in his lap, and stare at the wall. He didn't read. He didn't turn on the television. He just sat, existing on standby mode, waiting for his alpha to command him. At first, Julian convinced himself that this was merely the adjustment period. The brochures had mentioned a temporary state of extreme docility. But by the second week, the silence began to feel less like peace and more like a vacuum sucking the air out of the room. One evening, Julian came home early, bringing a bouquet of vibrant sunflowers. They were Oliver's absolute favorite. Before the Institute, bringing Oliver sunflowers would guarantee a squeal of delight, a tackle onto the sofa, and a messy, enthusiastic kiss that tasted like sunshine. Julian walked into the living room and found Oliver standing by the window, staring blankly at the rain. "Oliver, I brought you something," Julian called out, holding up the bright yellow flowers. Oliver turned slowly. His face remained a blank, porcelain mask. He walked over, his footsteps making zero sound on the floor, and stopped at the requisite 6-foot distance. He looked at the flowers, then at Julian. "These are Helianthus annuus," Oliver stated in his flat, robotic monotone. "They are biologically categorized as weeds in certain agricultural sectors, but they are aesthetically pleasing. Shall I dispose of them, or would you prefer I place them in a water receptacle?" Julian's hand dropped. The bright yellow petals suddenly looked garish and tragic against the sterile environment. "They're for you, Ollie. Don't you like them? You used to love sunflowers." "I have no preferences," Oliver replied, taking the bouquet with mechanical efficiency. His fingers brushed against Julian's, and Julian flinched. Oliver's skin was freezing cold. "Preferences lead to emotional clutter. The Institute eliminated my clutter. I am now a perfect vessel for your comfort, Alpha. I will place these in a vase." As Oliver turned and walked toward the kitchen, Julian felt a sudden, suffocating panic rising in his throat. He followed his mate, watching as Oliver meticulously trimmed the stems at a precise 45-degree angle, entirely devoid of joy. "Oliver, stop," Julian said softly. Oliver immediately froze, dropping the scissors. "Yes, Alpha. I have ceased movement. Look at me." Oliver turned his head. His dead, green eyes met Julian's. "Talk to me," Julian pleaded, stepping closer. "Tell me one of your stories. Tell me about the painting you wanted to start. You were babbling about a canvas with blue and gold before you left. Tell me about the blue." Oliver tilted his head slightly, like a computer processing a complicated algorithm. "I do not paint anymore, Alpha. Painting requires imagination. Imagination is a symptom of a restless mind. You requested a quiet mate. I am quiet. I didn't want you empty. Julian's voice cracked, echoing loudly in the massive kitchen. The sound of his own raised voice startled him, but it didn't even make Oliver blink. I am not empty, Oliver corrected smoothly, stepping forward and raising a perfectly steady hand to touch Julian's cheek. The gesture was meant to be affectionate, but it felt like being touched by a mannequin. I am full of obedience. I love you, Alpha. You explained that my noise was a defect. I am cured. Oliver dropped his hand and turned back to the flowers. I will finish this task now, so that I may be ready for your next instruction. Julian stumbled back, gripping the edge of the marble island to steady himself. He looked at the man he had married, the vibrant, beautiful, chaotic storm that used to fill this penthouse with life, and realized with horrifying clarity what he had done. He hadn't bought peace. He had bought a lobotomy. He had taken a singing bird, ripped out its vocal cords, and put it back in a golden cage, demanding it to look pretty. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was a deafening, suffocating roar. It was a few days later when Julian realized the true, terrifying extent of Oliver's perfection. Julian had a very old, battered answering machine tape locked in his desk drawer. It was the only recording he had of his late mother's voice. He listened to it once a year on her birthday, allowing himself a rare moment of grief. When Julian opened the drawer, the tape was gone. Frantic, he tore apart his study. Oliver, he roared, his alpha pheromones spiking with distress. Oliver appeared in the doorway instantly, his face a serene, emotionless mask. Yes, Alpha. Where is the tape? The small cassette tape that was in my drawer. Julian demanded, his chest heaving. Oliver blinked. I disposed of it. You what? Julian screamed, crossing the room and grabbing Oliver by the shoulders. He shook him, desperate to rattle something, anything, out of the Omega. Why would you do that? That was my mother's voice. Oliver's body remained entirely limp, absorbing the shaking without resistance. I conducted a routine cleaning of your workspace, Alpha. I analyzed the auditory data on that primitive device. The vocal tones recorded on it consistently caused your heart rate to spike and your cortisol levels to rise whenever you engaged with it in the past. I have deleted all the voicemails from your late mother, Alpha. They contained unnecessary emotional fluctuations that hindered your productivity. Julian let go of Oliver as if he had been burned. He backed away, his hands trembling violently, staring at his mate in absolute horror. You requested an environment free of emotional chaos, Oliver continued, his flat, musical voice piercing the silent room like a needle. I am maintaining the serenity of our home. Are you pleased, Alpha? Julian collapsed into his desk chair, burying his face in his hands, letting out a shattered, broken sob. The silence he had paid a fortune for was slowly, methodically destroying him. And the most terrifying part was the chilling, hollow gaze of his husband, watching him break, without a single ounce of pity. End of Part 1. Part 2. The Art of Emptiness. The hours that followed the destruction of the cassette tape dragged on in a suffocating, gelatinous crawl. Julian spent the remainder of the night on his hands and knees in the penthouse's industrial trash room, digging through bags of refuse, his expensive silk tie ruined, his hands covered in grime. He searched frantically, his cedarwood pheromones souring into the sharp, bitter scent of burnt coffee and desperation. He didn't find it. Oliver had been agonizingly thorough. The tape had been incinerated in the building's disposal unit. When Julian finally dragged himself back up to the penthouse as dawn broke over the city skyline, he found Oliver exactly where he had left him. The Omega was standing in the center of the study, facing the wall, his hands neatly clasped behind his back in a standard parade rest. He hadn't moved a single inch in 6 hours. Oliver, Julian rasped, his throat raw, his eyes bloodshot. Did you stand there all night? Oliver turned his head with that smooth, frictionless glide that made Julian's stomach churn. You did not issue a sleep directive, Alpha. I awaited your return to ensure no further tasks were required before initiating my dormant cycle. Julian felt a physical ache radiate from his chest, a heavy, sinking realization that he was entirely out of his depth. He stumbled to his desk, grabbing his phone with shaking hands. He bypassed his assistants and dialed the private emergency number for the Serenity Institute. The phone rang 3 times before a smooth, clinical voice answered. Serenity Institute, Dr. Eris speaking. Mr. Vance, I assume? Your biometric caller ID is on screen. Is there an issue with your unit's performance? Your unit. The words made Julian nauseous. What did you do to him? Julian hissed, gripping the edge of the mahogany desk so hard his knuckles turned white. You told me it was a conditioning program. You said you were going to teach him emotional regulation. He's a shell, Eris. He's a terrifying, empty shell. He deleted a priceless memento of my mother because he calculated it was inefficient for my mood. A soft, condescending sigh echoed through the receiver. Mr. Vance, please lower your voice. You are projecting unnecessary aggression. We performed exactly the procedures outlined in your contract. The temperament realignment therapy involves the surgical cauterization of the hyperactive emotional pathways in the Omega brain. You explicitly requested a mate who would prioritize your productivity and comfort over his own chaotic impulses. He assessed a trigger for your cortisol spikes and eliminated it. That is peak efficiency. He is functioning flawlessly. I didn't want a robot. Julian yelled, the sound echoing off the glass walls. I want to undo it. How do we reverse this? I'll pay double, triple, whatever it takes. Just turn it off and bring him back. There is no turning it off, Mr. Vance, Dr. Eris replied, his tone dropping its polite veneer, becoming cold and absolute. The pathways are severed. You cannot unburn a bridge. You asked for a quiet, perfectly submissive Omega. We delivered a masterpiece. If you are experiencing buyer's remorse, I suggest you schedule a session with one of our integration counselors. Have a productive day. The line went dead. Julian stared at the phone as it beeped in his hand. Severed. The word echoed in his mind, a death sentence delivered in a sterile, corporate tone. He looked up at Oliver. The Omega was watching him, his glassy green eyes unblinking, his face a perfect canvas of absolute nothingness. Are you experiencing distress, Alpha? Oliver asked, his voice melodic but entirely flat. Shall I prepare a mild sedative tea? Chamomile has been scientifically proven to reduce alpha agitation by 24%. No, Julian choked out, tears finally breaking free and tracking down his exhausted face. No tea, Oliver. Desperation is a cruel motivator. By the afternoon, Julian was possessed by a manic, frantic need to prove the doctor wrong. He refused to believe that the vibrant, chaotic, endlessly loving boy he had married was entirely gone. The brain was neuroplastic, wasn't it? He just needed to find the right trigger. He needed to shock Oliver's system back online. Julian practically ran down the hallway to the locked storage room at the end of the penthouse. When Oliver had first gone to the clinic, Julian had ordered the housekeeping staff to pack up every single art supply in the apartment. He had hated the mess. He had hated the smell of turpentine and the smears of paint on the doorframes. Now he viewed those boxes as lifelines. He dragged 3 heavy boxes into the pristine, minimalist living room, tearing the tape off with frantic hands. He pulled out the splattered wooden easel, a dozen blank canvases, and a mountain of acrylic and oil paints. He found Oliver's favorite painting overalls, a hideous, oversized denim monstrosity covered in a rainbow of permanent stains. Oliver, come here, Julian called out, his voice cracking with a desperate kind of hope. Oliver materialized in the doorway silently. He looked at the explosion of color and clutter on the white Persian rug, but his expression did not change. His scent remained non-existent. Look, Julian panted, holding up a tube of bright cerulean blue paint. Look at this, Ollie. It's your paints. I brought them all out. You can make a mess. I don't care about the rug. I don't care about the furniture. You can paint the walls if you want. Do you remember the mural you wanted to do of the ocean? Let's do it right now. Julian shoved the heavy, stained overalls into Oliver's chest. Oliver did not reach up to catch them. They hit his chest and fell to the floor in a sad, heavy heap. Oliver looked down at the overalls, then up at Julian. Is there a structural flaw in the walls that requires covering, Alpha? No. No structural flaws. It's for fun. It's for you to express yourself. Paint something. Anything. Julian grabbed a canvas and set it on the easel, then shoved a palette and a fistful of brushes into Oliver's unresisting hands. Show me what you're feeling. Oliver stood rigidly before the easel. He stared at the blank white canvas for a full 2 minutes. Julian held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He waited for the spark. He waited for Oliver to dip his fingers in the paint, to laugh, to smear a streak of yellow across his own nose like he used to do when he was lost in a creative frenzy. Instead, Oliver methodically placed the brushes down on the table, aligning them perfectly parallel to one another. He picked up a tube of matte black paint and a ruler. He squeezed a tiny, precise amount of paint onto the smallest, stiffest brush. Moving with the eerie mechanical precision of a factory arm, Oliver placed the ruler against the canvas and drew a single, perfectly straight horizontal black line across the exact center of the white space. It took him exactly 15 seconds. He then washed the brush in the turpentine cup, wiped it dry, and set it back down in its parallel alignment. He took 2 steps back and bowed his head. The task is complete, Alpha. Julian stared at the single, stark black line dissecting the white canvas. It was the most depressing, soulless thing he had ever seen. It was a visual representation of a flat line. "What is this?" Julian whispered, his voice trembling. "It is a line," Oliver replied, his voice devoid of any artistic pride or emotion. "It is straight. It divides the space equally, ensuring maximum efficiency of the surface area. I have minimized the mess as you previously instructed during our cohabitation." Julian felt his knees give out. He sank to the floor amidst the tubes of vibrant paint, covering his mouth to stifle the agonizing sob that tore from his throat. The colors around him felt like a cruel mockery. He had asked for a quiet life, but he had accidentally engineered a funeral for a living boy. The sound of the private elevator chiming broke through Julian's breakdown. The heavy oak doors swung open, and heavy, confident footsteps echoed into the foyer. It was Ethan, Julian's older brother, a man as ruthless in business as Julian, but far more observant. Ethan had never been Oliver's biggest fan. He found the Omega's chatter exhausting, but he tolerated him for Julian's sake. "Julian, you missed the quarterly acquisition briefing," Ethan barked, striding into the living room, loosening his tie. "I had to cover for you with the board. What the hell is going on?" Ethan stopped dead in his tracks. He looked at Julian, kneeling on the floor, weeping into a pile of art supplies. Then, his eyes shifted to Oliver. Oliver immediately turned toward Ethan. He did not wave. He did not offer his usual, overly enthusiastic greeting of, "Hi, Ethan. Did you know a group of flamingos is called a flamboyance?" Instead, Oliver executed a precise, 45-degree bow. "Good afternoon, Alpha Vance. Would you like me to take your coat? I can also prepare a caffeinated beverage to optimal temperature." Ethan frowned, his own alpha aura bristling with sudden, instinctive unease. He looked at Oliver's glassy eyes, the rigid posture, the absolute absence of the sweet, vanilla and honey scent that usually preceded the Omega by 10 feet. "What's wrong with him?" Ethan asked, his voice dropping to a low, cautious rumble. He took a step closer to Oliver, waving a hand in front of the Omega's face. Oliver didn't blink. He just stared through Ethan's hand at a fixed point on the wall. "Julian, why does your mate look like a taxidermy project?" Julian couldn't speak. He just shook his head, burying his face in his hands. Ethan grabbed Oliver's chin, tilting his face up. Oliver offered no resistance, his neck muscles entirely slack. Ethan's eyes narrowed as he inspected the faint, almost invisible surgical scars hidden beneath Oliver's perfectly styled hairline. "Did you take him to that clinic?" Ethan whispered, a genuine note of horror creeping into his normally stoic voice. "Julian, tell me you didn't take him to the Serenity Institute. I just wanted him to be quiet." Julian screamed, a pathetic, broken defense that tasted like ash in his mouth. "He was ruining my focus. He wouldn't stop making noise." Ethan let go of Oliver's chin as if the Omega were contagious. He looked at his younger brother with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. It was a look Julian had never seen on Ethan's face before. "You stupid, arrogant bastard," Ethan sneered, backing away toward the door. "He was the only good thing in your miserable, sterile life. You didn't just quiet him down, Julian. You scooped his soul out. You'd better hope to whatever God you pray to that you can fix this, because right now, you don't have a husband. You have a hostage." Ethan turned and walked out, the heavy doors slamming shut behind him, leaving Julian alone in the crushing, absolute silence of his own making, with only the perfectly straight black line on the canvas to keep him company. End of Part 2. Part 3. The Gathering of Ghosts. The invitation to the annual Sterling family dinner had been sitting on Julian's desk for 3 weeks, a piece of heavy cream-colored cardstock that now felt as threatening as a death warrant. The Sterlings, Oliver's family, were a boisterous, tightly knit clan of traditionalists. They were loud, affectionate, and fiercely protective of their youngest Omega. Elias Sterling, Oliver's father, was a mountain of a man whose booming laugh could shake the foundations of a house. Noah, Oliver's older alpha brother, was a rising star in corporate law who had spent his entire childhood shielding his eccentric, colorful little brother from the harsh realities of the world. Julian stared at the invitation, a sickening weight settling in the pit of his stomach. In previous years, the drive to the Sterling estate had been a chaotic, headache-inducing affair. Oliver would insist on controlling the car's radio, flipping through stations, singing at the top of his lungs, completely off-key. He would roll the windows down, regardless of the temperature, just to feel the wind in his wild curls, babbling excitedly about the pies his mother had baked or the new stray dog his father had undoubtedly adopted. Now, as the sleek Blacktown car glided through the winding, tree-lined roads toward the estate, the interior was dead silent. Julian sat stiffly in the plush leather seat, his jaw clenched so tightly his teeth ached. Beside him, Oliver sat perfectly upright. His hands were folded meticulously in his lap. He stared straight ahead at the partition separating them from the driver, his glassy green eyes unblinking, his breathing so shallow and rhythmic it barely registered. He wore a high-collared, immaculate navy blue sweater that Julian had specifically chosen to cover the faint, fading surgical scars at his temples. He looked like a masterpiece carved from ice, beautiful, flawless, and entirely lifeless. "Oliver," Julian ventured, his voice sounding entirely too loud in the suffocating quiet of the car. "We are almost at your parents' house. Do you remember the protocols for family gatherings?" Oliver turned his head with that terrifying, frictionless glide. "Yes, Alpha. I am to remain polite. I am to speak when spoken to. I am to avoid controversial topics and ensure your comfort is prioritized throughout the social engagement. I have reviewed your previous complaints regarding my past behavior. I will not consume excessive sugar. I will not raise my voice decibel level above conversational norms, and I will not initiate unprompted physical contact with the family canine." The recitation was flawless, delivered in a melodic, hollow monotone that made Julian's blood run cold. It was exactly what Julian had always demanded. Hearing it repeated back to him, like lines of code, made him want to open the car door and roll into the oncoming traffic. "You don't." Julian swallowed hard, his throat tight. "You don't have to be completely silent, Ollie. You can hug your father. You can talk to Noah. Just be yourself, but calmer." "I am myself, Alpha," Oliver replied, turning his gaze back to the partition. "The chaotic elements have been successfully excised. I am operating at optimal efficiency." The car rolled to a stop in front of the sprawling, rustic stone manor. Before the driver could even put the vehicle in park, the heavy oak front door of the estate burst open. Elias Sterling stood on the porch, a wide, joyful grin splitting his weathered face. The warm, inviting sense of wood smoke, roasting meats, and baked apples spilled out into the chilly evening air. Julian felt a cold sweat break out across the back of his neck. He stepped out of the car, rounding the back to open Oliver's door. Oliver stepped out gracefully, his movements fluid but devoid of any eager bounce. "There's my boy," Elias boomed, his deep alpha voice echoing across the driveway. He marched down the stone steps, his arms wide open, expecting what he had received for 22 years. His vibrant Omega son launching himself into a bone-crushing hug, rambling about a dozen different things at once. Elias reached the bottom of the steps. Oliver stopped exactly 3 paces away. He placed his hands flat against the sides of his trousers and executed a perfect 45-degree bow. "Good evening, Father," Oliver said, his voice a flat, horizontal line of sound. "It is a pleasure to be in your presence. Your estate appears to be in optimal condition." Elias froze. His massive arms hovered awkwardly in the air. The joyous smile on his face slowly melted into a mask of utter bewilderment. He looked at Oliver's rigid posture, the glassy, vacant stare, and then slowly turned his gaze to Julian. "Julian," Elias asked, a nervous chuckle escaping his lips. "What's this? Some kind of new game he's playing? Did you two make a bet that he couldn't act serious for 5 minutes?" He's just matured, Elias," Julian lied, the words tasting like battery acid on his tongue. "He's been working on his composure. We've had a quiet few weeks." Before Elias could push the issue, Noah stepped out onto the porch. Noah possessed the sharp, predatory instincts of a high-tier alpha, and unlike his father, he was inherently suspicious of Julian. Noah's eyes narrowed the moment they landed on his younger brother. He didn't see a boy playing a game. He saw a prey animal that had been cornered and broken. "Oliver," Noah commanded sharply, descending the stairs. Oliver immediately swiveled his head toward his brother, bowing again. "Good evening, Brother Noah. I am pleased to see you." Noah didn't respond to the greeting. Instead, he stepped directly into Oliver's personal space, flaring his alpha pheromones, a heavy, protective scent of thunderstorms and damp earth. Usually, an aggressive display like this would make Oliver whine, hide behind Julian, or start frantically babbling apologies. Oliver didn't even blink. He stood absolutely still, completely unaffected by the pheromonal pressure, his face a serene, empty canvas. "Where is his scent, Julian?" Noah asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low rumble. He leaned in, sniffing the air around Oliver's neck. "He smells like hospital-grade antiseptic and your cedarwood. Where is the vanilla? Where is his honey? Why does my brother smell like a ghost?" Julian took a step back, his heart hammering against his ribs. He's wearing a new cologne. A suppressive one. For professional settings. It was my idea. Noah reached out and grabbed Oliver by the shoulders. "Ollie, look at me. Tell me about the painting you were working on before you left. The one with the sunflowers." Oliver tilted his head, his eyes tracking Noah's face with unsettling, robotic precision. "I no longer paint, brother Noah. Art requires emotional clutter. Alpha Julian prefers a quiet, efficient environment. I have eliminated my hobbies to better serve my household duties. Would you like me to assist with the culinary preparations inside?" The silence that fell over the driveway was absolute. It wasn't the peaceful, curated silence Julian had craved. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a graveyard. Elias let out a choked, horrified breath, bringing a trembling hand to his mouth. He finally saw what Noah had seen. The missing spark. The deadened eyes. The mechanical fluidity of his son's movements. "What did you do?" Noah whispered, his hands tightening on Oliver's shoulders. Oliver remained completely limp, a rag doll in a designer sweater. "What the hell did you do to him, Julian?" "Nothing." Julian stammered, panic finally bleeding into his voice as the sheer weight of his actions crashed down on him in front of Oliver's family. "I took him to a clinic. They just helped him regulate his temperament. He was out of control, Noah. He was ruining my life with his constant noise and his messes. I just wanted him to be calm." "A clinic," Noah roared, the sound echoing like a gunshot. He released Oliver and lunged at Julian, grabbing him by the lapels of his expensive coat and slamming him back against the side of the town car. The metal groaned under the impact. "You took him to the Serenity Institute, didn't you? You arrogant, soulless piece of filth. You lobotomized my brother. He's stable." Julian yelled back, tears of defensive panic blurring his vision. "He's happy. Tell them, Oliver. Tell them you're happy." Julian and Noah both snapped their heads toward Oliver, panting, desperate for the Omega to react. To cry, to scream, to do anything to break the horrifying tension. Oliver simply stood on the gravel driveway, his hands folded neatly in front of him. He looked at Julian being pinned against the car by a furious Alpha, and his expression did not change. Happiness is a subjective emotional state characterized by chemical fluctuations in the brain, Oliver recited, his melodic, empty voice cutting through the damp night air. "I do not experience fluctuations. I am functioning optimally. Alpha Julian is a superior provider. I am satisfied with my placement." Elias broke down. The massive, imposing Alpha fell to his knees on the gravel, burying his face in his hands, letting out a raw, agonizing sob that tore at Julian's remaining shreds of sanity. The father wept for the son who was standing right in front of him, yet a million miles away. Noah's grip on Julian's coat tightened until the fabric tore. "I am going to kill you," Noah promised, his eyes flashing red with primal rage. "I am going to tear you apart, Julian. But first, I am taking him inside. You are leaving. You will never, ever look at him again." Noah let go of Julian, shoving him away in disgust. He walked over to Oliver, his demeanor instantly softening, his hands trembling as he gently took his brother's arm. "Come on, Ollie. Let's go inside. Mom is making your favorite pie. You're staying with us now." For a split second, Julian thought it was over. He thought the nightmare was ending, that he had lost his mate, his reputation, and his life. But then, Oliver stopped walking. He dug his expensive leather shoes into the gravel, resisting Noah's gentle pull with a sudden, rigid strength. "Brother Noah," Oliver said softly, staring blankly ahead. "I cannot cross this threshold." Noah froze, looking back at him with tear-filled eyes. "What? Why not, sweetheart? You're safe here." Oliver slowly turned his head to look at Julian, who was leaning against the car, gasping for breath, completely shattered. "I belong to Alpha Julian," Oliver stated. My programming dictates that I remain in his proximity unless authorized otherwise. I require permission. Oliver's dead, green eyes bored into Julian's soul. Alpha, do I have your permission to transfer my location to this estate? Julian felt his heart shatter into 1,000 jagged, irreparable pieces. The boy who used to hate rules, who used to break every convention just to see the world burn in beautiful colors, was now asking for permission to seek refuge with his own family. No, Julian choked out, the word tasting like poison. If he let Oliver go, he was admitting he had murdered him. If he took him back, he was a monster. But the selfish, terrified Alpha inside him couldn't let go of the hollow shell. No, Oliver. Get in the car. We are going home. Understood, Oliver replied instantly. He pulled his arm out of Noah's loose grip without a second of hesitation. He turned his back on his weeping father and his horrified brother, walking mechanically toward the open door of the town car. Noah tried to lunge forward to stop him, but Elias caught his son's arm, shaking his head through his sobs. They both knew that forcing the issue now, against the Omega's conditioned directives, would only cause a psychological breakdown. They had to fight this legally. They had to destroy Julian Vance in the courts. Julian slid into the car beside his mate, his entire body trembling violently. As the car pulled away, leaving the devastated Sterling family standing in the driveway, Julian buried his face in his hands and wept. He wept for the laughter he would never hear again, for the ruined sweaters, for the chaotic, beautiful love he had thrown into an incinerator because he had been too arrogant to appreciate the noise. Beside him, Oliver sat perfectly still, staring at the partition. But as Julian's sobs filled the confined space of the vehicle, hidden from the Alpha's view, Oliver's hands, previously resting limply in his lap, slowly curled into tight, white-knuckled fists. The glassy, vacant look in his eyes cracked for just a fraction of a second, replaced by a sharp, venomous spark of pure, unadulterated hatred. The ghost was not dead. It was just waiting for the right moment to haunt the castle to the ground. End of Part 3. Part 4. The Symphony of the Damned. The penthouse of the Vance Tower, once a sanctuary of minimalist perfection, had become a mausoleum. For a man who had built his entire empire on the foundation of control and calculated silence, Julian Vance was rapidly discovering that there was a profound difference between the absence of noise and the presence of death. It had been 4 days since the disastrous visit to the Sterling estate. The threat of a massive legal war loomed over Julian's head, as Noah Sterling had already begun filing motions to seize medical records and contest the legality of the Serenity Institute's procedures. But the impending courtroom battle was nothing compared to the psychological warfare being waged inside Julian's own home. The silence was a living, breathing entity. It pressed against the glass walls, suffocating the space, making the air feel heavy and stale. Julian had stopped going to the office. He had delegated his CEO responsibilities to his brother, Ethan, who still refused to look Julian in the eye. Julian spent his days pacing the sprawling living room, an untouched glass of scotch permanently fused to his hand, his usually immaculate suits wrinkled and smelling of stale alcohol and sour, distressed cedarwood. And through it all, Oliver was a masterpiece of terrifying compliance. He operated on a schedule that was agonizing in its precision. At exactly 6 a.m., Oliver would rise from the edge of the bed, where he slept on his back, hands folded over his chest like a corpse, and prepare a flawlessly balanced breakfast. He would place the plate before Julian at 6:45 a.m., bow at 45 degrees, and state, "Your nutritional intake is prepared, Alpha." He did not steal the bacon. He did not hum off-key while whisking the eggs. He did not chatter about the strange dream he had about a talking octopus. He simply retreated to the corner of the room, stood with his hands behind his back, and stared at the wall until Julian dismissed him. Julian was losing his mind. Desperate for a reprieve, desperate for someone to tell him this was a nightmare he could wake up from, Julian had spent an exorbitant amount of money to fly in Dr. Alastair Harrison, one of the world's leading independent neurosurgeons. If the Serenity Institute wouldn't reverse the procedure, Julian would find someone who could. Dr. Harrison was an older, stern alpha with a reputation for uncompromising ethics. He had arrived at the penthouse with a team of technicians and a portable, state-of-the-art neurological scanner. The living room had been temporarily converted into a sterile diagnostic clinic. Oliver sat in the center of the room, a nest of wires and sensors attached to his temples and the base of his skull. He hadn't flinched when the cold gel was applied. He hadn't asked a single question about the intrusive machinery. He merely stared straight ahead, his glassy green eyes fixed on the distant city skyline beyond the windows. Julian stood in the corner, chewing on his thumbnail, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs as Dr. Harrison stared at the glowing monitors. "Well," Julian croaked, unable to bear the silence any longer. "What do you see, Alistair? Is it reversible? Can you stimulate the pathways? I have limitless funds. Just tell me what machinery to buy, what drugs to import." Dr. Harrison did not speak immediately. He unhooked his reading glasses, letting them hang from the chain around his neck, and turned to look at Julian. The older Alpha's expression was one of profound, chilling revulsion. "Mr. Vance," Dr. Harrison began, his voice dangerously low. "When you initially contacted me, you stated that your mate had suffered a severe neurological trauma. You omitted the fact that this trauma was elective, premeditated, and systematically executed by the butchers at the Serenity Institute. I didn't know they were going to do this," Julian yelled, stepping forward, his hands trembling. "They promised a conditioning program, a behavioral adjustment." "Behavioral adjustment?" Dr. Harrison scoffed, gesturing violently toward the monitors. "Look at this scan, Julian. The prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, the emotional regulation centers, they haven't just been suppressed. They have been chemically and surgically cauterized. The neural bridges that facilitate joy, anxiety, passion, and creativity are practically non-existent. They burned his soul out of his skull to make him convenient for you." Julian felt the blood drain from his face. "But there has to be a way to heal it. The brain is neuroplastic. We can teach him again. We can trigger a memory. You cannot regrow a severed limb with positive thinking, and you cannot resurrect a dead emotional core with a memory," Dr. Harrison snapped, entirely ignoring the dominant alpha aura Julian was leaking into the room. The doctor walked over to Oliver, gently placing a hand on the Omega's shoulder. Oliver turned his head slowly. "Is the diagnostic procedure complete, Doctor? Alpha Julian requires a tranquil environment. This machinery is emitting a low-frequency hum that may disturb him." Dr. Harrison's face softened into an expression of deep, tragic pity. "Yes, Oliver. We are finished. Does anything hurt?" "Pain is a biological indicator of tissue damage," Oliver recited in his melodic, hollow tone. "My current tissue integrity is intact. I feel nothing." Dr. Harrison turned back to Julian, his eyes blazing. "I will not take your money, Mr. Vance. I want nothing to do with this atrocity. But I will tell you this. Noah Sterling contacted me yesterday. He asked me to testify as an expert witness in his upcoming lawsuit against you and that cursed institute. After seeing this," the doctor pointed a shaking finger at Oliver, "I accepted his offer. I am going to help them tear you to pieces. Good day." The doctor signaled his technicians. They packed their equipment in heavy, suffocating silence and left the penthouse, leaving Julian utterly alone with his perfect, broken mate. The reality of the situation crashed over Julian like a tidal wave of ice water. There was no cure. There was no redemption. He was trapped in this pristine hell of his own design. As the sun set, casting long, bloody shadows across the marble floors, Julian walked over to the sleek, modern record player in the corner of the room. His hands shook as he flipped through the vinyl collection, pulling out an old, scratched jazz record. It was the song that had played on their first anniversary. The night Oliver had drank too much champagne, kicked off his shoes, and dragged Julian into a messy, laughing, breathless dance in the middle of this very room. Julian dropped the needle. The soft, soulful notes of a saxophone drifted through the silent penthouse. "Oliver," Julian whispered. Oliver immediately stepped out of the shadows, his posture flawless. "Yes, Alpha. The audio volume is at 30%. Shall I decrease it further?" "No," Julian choked out, tears spilling over his eyelashes and tracking hot paths down his cheeks. He stepped forward, reaching out a trembling hand. "Dance with me." Oliver blinked once. "I am not equipped with professional choreographic data, Alpha. However, I can attempt to mirror your movements to ensure your satisfaction." Julian grabbed Oliver's hand. The Omega's fingers were ice cold, entirely devoid of the frantic, nervous energy that used to make his hands sweat. Julian pulled Oliver flush against his chest, wrapping his other arm around the Omega's narrow waist. Usually, Oliver would melt into Julian's embrace. He would bury his face in Julian's neck, inhaling the cedarwood scent deeply, humming happily against his skin. Now Oliver stood rigid. His body was stiff, resisting the natural curve of the embrace. He placed his left hand precisely on Julian's shoulder, applying exactly zero pressure. Julian began to sway to the music, pulling Oliver with him. It was like dancing with a mannequin. There was no resistance, but there was no participation either. Oliver merely allowed himself to be moved, a lifeless puppet being dragged across the floor by a desperate, grieving puppeteer. "Please, Ollie," Julian sobbed, burying his face in Oliver's pristine, unscented hair. "Please come back. I'll give up the company. We can move to the country. You can have a garden. You can paint the whole house. Just come back to me. I have not departed, Alpha." Oliver's voice drifted over Julian's shoulder, chillingly calm against the backdrop of the emotional jazz music. "I am here. I am fulfilling your request for physical intimacy. Your heart rate is currently elevated. Are you experiencing a cardiac event?" Julian stopped dancing. He collapsed to his knees right there on the rug, pulling Oliver down with him. He wrapped his arms around Oliver's waist, burying his face in the Omega's stomach, weeping with the kind of primal, agonizing grief that tore at the vocal cords. It was the sound of a man mourning the absolute destruction of his own world. Oliver knelt on the floor, his posture perfectly straight, towering over his broken Alpha. He did not reach down to stroke Julian's hair. He did not offer words of comfort. He simply stared blankly at the wall, waiting for the display of emotional clutter to cease so he could resume his standby mode. Later that night, after Julian had cried himself into an exhausted, alcohol-induced stupor on the sofa, Oliver silently rose from the floor. He moved with that same robotic glide, ensuring his footsteps made absolutely no sound, and walked into the master bathroom. He closed the heavy oak door, locking it with a soft click. The bathroom was dark, illuminated only by the harsh, cold moonlight spilling through the skylight. Oliver walked up to the massive mirror, spanning the double vanity. He stood there for a long moment, staring at his own reflection. His face was the same perfect, porcelain mask of emptiness he had maintained for weeks. Slowly, deliberately, Oliver reached up and touched the faint, surgical scars at his temples. The silence in the bathroom was absolute. Then the mask cracked. The rigid, robotic lines of Oliver's face suddenly relaxed. The dead, glassy emptiness in his green eyes vanished, replaced by a sharp, venomous, and terrifyingly lucid fire. A slow, chilling smile spread across his lips, a smile devoid of warmth, dripping with calculated malice and triumphant cruelty. He leaned closer to the mirror, his chest rising and falling not in a measured, algorithmic rhythm, but with the heavy, adrenaline-fueled breaths of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. "Dance with me," Oliver mocked in a whisper, his voice no longer flat and melodic, but raspy, dark, and utterly sane. He let out a low, breathless laugh that sounded like shattered glass. He looked at his reflection, his eyes burning with the cold satisfaction of a boy who had willingly stepped into an incinerator just so he could pull his Alpha into the flames with him. Dr. Harrison was a brilliant man, but he was arrogant. He had looked at the scans provided by the Serenity Institute and believed them. He didn't know that Oliver had spent the entire 3 weeks at the clinic secretly learning how to manipulate the biofeedback machines, how to mimic a flatline, and how to forge a digital trail of destruction. Oliver traced the fake scars on his temples, his smile widening into something monstrous. Julian wanted a quiet life. Julian wanted an obedient, hollow shell. And Oliver was going to make sure Julian choked to death on the silence. End of Part 4. Part 5, The Anatomy of a Fall. The legal documents arrived on a Thursday, delivered in a thick, austere manila envelope by a courier who refused to look Julian in the eye. The penthouse was shrouded in a heavy, suffocating gloom. The automated smart blinds, which Julian had once programmed to open at dawn, remained tightly shut, casting the sprawling living room in perpetual twilight. Julian sat on the edge of the leather sofa, a glass of amber liquid trembling in his hand, his usually impeccable hair disheveled and unwashed. Oliver was the one who brought him the envelope. He walked across the room with that terrifying, frictionless glide, his footsteps making absolutely no sound on the hardwood floor. He extended his arms at a perfect 90-degree angle, offering the envelope to Julian. "A courier has delivered official correspondence, Alpha," Oliver stated, his voice a flat, melodic drone that seemed to vibrate with a cold, metallic resonance. "I have scanned the exterior. It originates from the Sterling and Hayes law firm. Shall I open it for you, or dispose of it to maintain your baseline heart rate?" Julian flinched at the sound of the law firm's name. Noah's firm. "Open it," Julian rasped, his voice raw from days of weeping and screaming into the empty void of his home. Oliver meticulously sliced the envelope open with a silver letter opener, sliding the heavy stack of legal papers out. He held them up, his glassy green eyes scanning the first page with the rapid, mechanical efficiency of a scanner. "It is a formal summons for a deposition, Alpha," Oliver recited without missing a beat, his expression entirely blank. "Alongside a civil lawsuit filed by Noah Sterling. You are being sued for extreme emotional distress, medical battery, and the gross violation of Omega protection rights. Furthermore, there is an injunction seeking the immediate annulment of our mating bond and my transfer into the custody of the Sterling family." Oliver lowered the papers, looking at Julian. "Would you like me to contact your legal representation, or shall I prepare a chamomile tea?" The juxtaposition was so jarring, so completely devoid of human empathy, that Julian felt a hysterical, broken laugh bubble up in his throat. It came out as a wet, pathetic sob. He reached out and snatched the papers from Oliver's perfectly steady hands, throwing them across the coffee table. "They want to take you away from me," Julian whispered, staring at his hands. "They want to annul the bond. An annulment would sever the legal and biological ties of our arrangement," Oliver replied helpfully, standing at parade rest. "If the court deems you an unfit alpha, I will be rehomed. I will comply with whatever directives the legal system inputs into my registry." He spoke of himself like a piece of stolen software being returned to its manufacturer. Julian's chest heaved. He looked up at his mate, desperate to find even a microscopic crack in the porcelain mask. "Do you want to leave me, Ollie? Tell me the truth. Do you want to go back to your family?" Oliver tilted his head, his face a chilling canvas of absolute nothingness. "I do not possess the capacity to want, Alpha. Wanting requires a preference, which is a byproduct of emotional clutter. My emotional pathways are cauterized. I am currently stationed in this penthouse. If I am moved, I will be stationed elsewhere. The geographical location does not alter my operational status." It was the perfect torture. If Oliver had screamed at him, cursed him, or physically attacked him, Julian could have borne it. He could have accepted the punishment. But this terrifying void-like apathy was peeling Julian's sanity away, layer by agonizing layer. The deposition preparation took place 3 days later in the penthouse. Julian's legal team, led by a ruthless, high-powered beta named Ms. Thorne, had arrived to do damage control. They had set up a mock courtroom at the massive dining table. Ms. Thorne was a woman who had defended corrupt politicians and embezzling CEOs without blinking. But as she sat across from Oliver, her professional veneer began to crack. "All right, Mr. Vance." "Oliver," Ms. Thorne started, adjusting her glasses. "When Noah Sterling's lawyers ask you about your time at the Serenity Institute, you need to emphasize that the procedure was consensual. Can you do that? Can you smile and tell the camera that you are happy with the results?" Oliver, sitting perfectly upright with his hands folded in his lap, slowly turned his head to face the lawyer. "I cannot state that I am happy, Ms. Thorne. Happiness is an emotional extreme. I can state that I am efficient." "Okay, but we need to soften your delivery," Thorne insisted, leaning forward, her scent betraying a spike of nervous anxiety. "Just smile. Show them that you are well cared for. Give me a genuine smile, Oliver." Oliver stared at her for 3 agonizingly long seconds. Initiating facial expression smile. What happened next made Ms. Thorne recoil in her chair. Oliver's facial muscles moved, but they moved completely independently of his eyes. The corners of his mouth pulled upward into a wide, stretching grimace, baring his teeth. It was perfectly symmetrical, perfectly stretched, and utterly terrifying. His green eyes remained wide, glassy, and completely dead. It was the smile of a corpse whose facial nerves had been hit with an electrical current. "Is this biological display satisfactory for the legal proceedings?" Oliver asked through his stretched, horrifying grin. Julian, who had been sitting at the end of the table with his head in his hands, let out a choked cry and bolted from the room. He ran to the guest bathroom, threw the door open, and vomited violently into the sink. Ms. Thorne slowly packed up her briefcase. She looked at the other lawyers on her team, all of whom were pale and sweating. "We can't put him on the stand," she whispered, her voice trembling. "If the judge sees him, if the jury sees him, Julian won't just lose the annulment. He'll go to federal prison. They'll string him up for human rights violations." While Julian's legal defense was crumbling, his empire was burning to the ground. The scandal had leaked to the press. The silent mate read the headlines of every major gossip column and Financial Times paper. The public outcry was deafening. Omega rights groups were protesting outside the Vance Tower. Stockholders were panicking. That evening, the private elevator chimed, and Ethan Vance stepped into the penthouse. He didn't look angry this time. He looked exhausted and completely devoid of familial warmth. Julian was slumped on the floor by the liquor cabinet, a half-empty bottle of scotch in his lap. Oliver was standing in the corner of the room, facing the wall, exactly where Julian had told him to wait 3 hours ago. "Get up, Julian," Ethan ordered, his voice cold and authoritative. Julian didn't move. He just stared at the amber liquid in his glass. "Did you come to yell at me again, Ethan? Save your breath. I already know what a monster I am. I didn't come to yell at you. I came to protect our family's legacy from the rot you've created," Ethan said, tossing a thick leather folder onto the coffee table. "The board held an emergency meeting this afternoon. Your position as CEO is no longer tenable. The stock has dropped 22% in 3 days. You are toxic." Julian finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "You're ousting me? You ousted yourself the day you decided to play God with another human being's brain," Ethan sneered. "Sign the papers, Julian. You are surrendering your shares, stepping down immediately, and transferring full executive control to me. If you fight this, the board will publicly condemn you, and I will personally hand over our internal emails to Noah Sterling's legal team." A month ago, Julian would have fought tooth and nail. He would have ripped Ethan apart in the boardroom. His identity, his pride, and his life were built entirely upon his corporate power. But as Julian looked at the papers, and then looked at the silent, motionless silhouette of his mate standing facing the wall, he realized none of it mattered. The power, the money, the pristine silence, it was all ash. Without a single word of protest, Julian uncapped his fountain pen and signed his empire away. "Take it," Julian whispered, dropping the pen. "Take it all. Just tell them to leave Oliver here. Tell Noah I'll give him all my money. Just let me keep him." Ethan looked down at his broken brother, entirely devoid of pity. "You don't want to keep him, Julian. You just don't want to be alone with your guilt." Ethan took the folder and left without looking back. That night, Julian experienced a terror unlike any he had ever known. He woke up at 3:14 a.m., his heart pounding from a nightmare where he was drowning in a sea of wet, colorful acrylic paint, unable to breathe. He gasped for air, sitting up in the massive king-sized bed. The room was pitch black. But as Julian's eyes adjusted to the darkness, he realized he wasn't alone. Oliver was standing perfectly still at the foot of the bed. He wasn't moving. He wasn't making a sound. He was just standing there in his silk pajamas, his head tilted downward, staring unblinkingly at Julian in the dark. "Oliver!" Julian gasped, scrambling backward against the headboard, a spike of genuine, primal fear shooting through his veins. What are you doing? Why are you out of bed?" Oliver's voice floated through the dark room, cold, detached, and entirely devoid of inflection. "In our 2nd year of marriage, you explicitly stated that my tossing and turning in the bed disrupted your REM sleep cycle, causing a decrease in your morning productivity. You requested that I remain completely still." Oliver took one slow, measured step forward. "I analyzed my sleep patterns and concluded that I could not guarantee absolute stillness while unconscious. Therefore, to ensure your optimal rest, Alpha, I have decided to cease sleeping beside you. I will stand here and monitor your respiration to guarantee that I do not breathe too loudly and disturb your peace." "No," Julian sobbed, covering his ears, squeezing his eyes shut. "No, Ollie, please go to sleep. Please just lie down. I am functioning perfectly, Alpha," the hollow voice echoed in the dark. "Are you not pleased? You wanted a quiet mate. I have given you absolute silence." Julian buried his face in his knees and wept until his throat bled. And standing at the foot of the bed, hidden entirely by the shadows of the room, the glassy emptiness in Oliver's eyes vanished once more. A dark, twisted smile of pure, euphoric vengeance carved its way across the Omega's face. He watched the powerful, ruthless Alpha Vance shatter into a million pathetic pieces, and for the first time in weeks, Oliver felt an overwhelming surge of joy. He was going to burn Julian's world to the ground, and he wouldn't even have to light the match. Julian was doing it all by himself. End of Part 5. Part 6. The Ghost in the Machine. The Vance penthouse, once a glittering jewel of modern architecture perched above the city, had devolved into a psychological prison. Dust gathered on the expensive glass tables. The floor-to-ceiling windows, which used to frame breathtaking sunsets, were smeared with fingerprints and grease. Julian Vance, the former king of the corporate world, was now the warden of a rotting castle and simultaneously its only inmate. It had been 3 weeks since Julian signed away his company. 3 weeks of living in a perpetual, agonizing state of hypervigilance. Julian's physical deterioration was shocking. His cheekbones jutted out sharply from his sallow face. His once immaculate hair was greasy and unkempt, and his alpha pheromones, once a commanding, crisp cedarwood, now reeked of sour anxiety, stale whiskey, and profound decay. He hadn't slept a full night in nearly a month. Every time he closed his eyes, he would wake up to find Oliver standing in the pitch-black room, staring at him, monitoring his breathing with the cold, unblinking intensity of a gargoyle. And Oliver was immaculate. The contrast between the two of them was terrifying. While Julian fell apart, Oliver maintained a state of synthetic, horrifying perfection. His clothes were never wrinkled. His hair was always precisely styled. He moved through the ruined penthouse like a spotless porcelain doll, stepping over empty Scotch bottles and discarded legal documents with algorithmic precision. He didn't clean the mess unless specifically instructed because, as he had coldly stated, "You did not input a sanitation directive, Alpha. I am conserving my energy for your direct commands." Julian was sitting on the floor of the kitchen, his back against the marble island, shivering despite the heavy cashmere blanket wrapped around his shoulders. He was staring at Oliver, who was currently standing in the center of the kitchen, executing a task Julian had given him in a moment of desperate, hysterical rage 2 hours ago. "Just sort the damn rice. Sort the white grains from the brown grains if you want to be so perfectly efficient." Julian had screamed, hurling a mixed bag of artisanal rice across the floor. Oliver was on his hands and knees. He was not crawling. He was kneeling rigidly, picking up one single grain of rice at a time with a pair of silver tweezers. He would inspect the grain, pivot his upper body at a precise 90-degree angle, and place it into one of 2 crystal bowls. Click, pivot, drop, pivot, click. The rhythmic, ceaseless sound of the tweezers hitting the marble floor was driving Julian utterly insane. "Stop," Julian whispered, his voice cracking, dragging his hands down his ruined face. "Stop it, Oliver. Please." Oliver froze mid-pivot. The tweezers hovered exactly 2 inches above the floor. "Directive acknowledged. I have ceased the sorting protocol. Would you like me to incinerate the remaining grains, or resume my standby posture?" "Just look at me," Julian begged, tears welling in his bloodshot eyes. He crawled across the floor, reaching out to grasp Oliver's pristine white collar. "Look at what you're doing to me. Look at what I am. I'm nothing. I've lost my company. I've lost my family. The world thinks I'm a monster. Are you satisfied? Is this quiet enough for you?" Oliver's glassy, empty green eyes bored into Julian's frantic, pleading ones. "Satisfaction is a neurochemical reward for achieving a desired outcome. My neurochemistry is flat. I am neither satisfied nor dissatisfied. I am merely present. Your current heart rate is dangerously elevated, Alpha. Shall I contact emergency medical services?" Julian let go of Oliver and collapsed onto the floor, curling into a fetal position, sobbing into the cold marble. He was trapped in a nightmare where the monster wasn't chasing him. It was just standing there, politely offering to make him tea while he bled to death. The intercom on the wall buzzed a harsh, shrill tone, shattering the silence. Julian flinched violently. He didn't move. A few seconds later, the heavy oak doors of the penthouse unlocked with a heavy thud. The building's concierge had overridden the security lock, a protocol only allowed for court-mandated entries. Heavy, aggressive footsteps echoed in the foyer. "Julian," a voice roared. The scent of thunderstorms and absolute, unyielding fury flooded the penthouse. It was Noah Sterling, and he was not alone. Behind him stood 2 uniformed police officers and a stern-looking beta woman holding a thick clipboard. Julian scrambled to his feet, leaning heavily against the kitchen counter for support. He looked like a cornered animal, his eyes darting wildly. Noah stopped at the edge of the kitchen, his jaw dropping in sheer disgust as he took in the state of the room, and the state of the Alpha, who had once been so obsessed with pristine appearances. But Noah's eyes immediately darted away from Julian, scanning the room frantically until they landed on his brother. Oliver was still kneeling on the floor, holding the silver tweezers. "Ollie," Noah breathed, his voice cracking. He ignored Julian entirely, rushing forward and dropping to his knees beside the Omega. "Ollie, it's me. It's Noah. Oliver slowly turned his head. Good morning, Brother Noah. I am currently awaiting my next directive from Alpha Julian. Are you here to issue a joint command? Noah squeezed his eyes shut, a tear slipping down his rugged face. He gently took the tweezers from Oliver's hand and pulled him up to a standing position. No, sweetheart. I'm here to take you out of this hellhole. Ms. Gable, please step forward. The beta woman stepped into the room, her expression hardened. Julian Vance. I am a court-appointed psychiatric evaluator. Mr. Sterling has successfully petitioned a judge for an emergency, supervised psychological assessment of the Omega, Oliver Vance, due to credible allegations of extreme medical abuse. I will be conducting a private interview with Oliver in the guest room. If you interfere, these officers will arrest you. Julian let out a hollow, broken laugh. Interview him? Go ahead. Ask him anything you want. He'll tell you exactly what he told me. He is a perfectly efficient machine. He doesn't have a soul left to interview. Noah's fists clenched, his knuckles turning white. He looked like he wanted to tear Julian's throat out with his bare teeth, but he restrained himself. He gently guided Oliver by the shoulders toward the guest bedroom. Oliver walked with that same, terrifying, gliding gait, unresisting and perfectly compliant. The door to the guest room clicked shut, leaving Julian alone in the kitchen with the two armed officers, who were staring at him with undisguised revulsion. Inside the guest room, the atmosphere was entirely different. The evaluator, Ms. Gable, set her clipboard down on a desk and pulled up 2 chairs. Sit down, please, Oliver. Oliver sat, his back ramrod straight, his hands folded in his lap. Noah pulled up a chair beside him, leaning in close, desperate to catch even a faint whiff of his brother's sweet vanilla scent. There was none, just the sterile smell of nothingness. Oliver, Ms. Gable started gently. I am here to help you. I know you underwent a procedure at the Serenity Institute. Can you tell me if you are experiencing any pain, emotional or physical? I am functioning optimally, Oliver recited, his eyes fixed on a spot on the wall behind the evaluator's head. I experience no pain. I am a quiet, obedient mate. Alpha Julian's household is peaceful. Noah let out a frustrated, heartbroken sob, burying his face in his hands. God, Ollie, please. It's just us. Please fight it. I know you're in there. You're the strongest person I know. Please. The room fell silent. Ms. Gable wrote something down on her clipboard, her expression grim. She was already preparing to recommend immediate extraction and institutional care. But then, the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. The terrifying, robotic rigidity in Oliver's shoulders suddenly melted away. The Omega let out a long, heavy sigh, a very human, very tired sigh that sounded utterly out of place coming from the porcelain doll. Noah's head snapped up. Oliver slowly turned his head to look at Noah. The glassy, empty veneer in his green eyes shattered. They were suddenly sharp, ancient, and burning with an intensely calculating intelligence. The innocent, chaotic spark of the old Oliver was completely gone, but it wasn't replaced by emptiness. It was replaced by the terrifying, cold presence of a predator. Turn off the recording device in your pocket, Ms. Gable, Oliver said. The voice was not the hollow, melodic drone of a robot, nor was it the breathless, hyperactive babble of the old Oliver. It was a smooth, commanding, and dangerously authoritative baritone that did not belong in the mouth of a submissive Omega. Ms. Gable gasped, dropping her pen. Noah froze in his chair, his alpha instincts flaring not with protectiveness, but with a sudden, deeply ingrained sense of submission to the sheer aura radiating from the boy beside him. What? Ms. Gable stammered. The digital recorder in your left breast pocket. Turn it off. Now. Oliver's eyes narrowed, pinning the woman in place. Trembling, the evaluator reached into her pocket, pulled out a small black device, and clicked it off. Oliver leaned back in his chair, crossing one leg over the other, a casual, arrogant posture that the old Oliver would never have possessed. He looked at Noah, who was staring at him as if he had just seen a ghost resurrect itself. What are you? Noah whispered, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. You're not my brother. No, I am not, the Omega replied smoothly, an icy smile playing on his lips. Your brother died on an operating table in that clinic, Noah. Not physically. But when that bastard Julian locked the door and left him in the hands of that butcher, the original soul in this body shattered from the sheer weight of the betrayal. He couldn't bear to exist in a world where the man he loved viewed his joy as a disease. Noah felt the air leave his lungs. Then who are you? I am a traveler, Oliver, or the entity wearing his face said calmly. I come from a world far older and far bloodier than this one. My name was Orion. I was a sovereign, a tactician, and I died on a battlefield. When I opened my eyes, I was strapped to a chair in the Serenity Institute, staring at a doctor holding a neurocauterizer. Ms. Gable pressed her back against the wall, her eyes wide with terror, unsure if she was witnessing a severe dissociative identity disorder or something far beyond the realm of science. I assessed the situation, Orion continued, inspecting his immaculate fingernails. I accessed the original host's memories. I saw what Julian Vance did. I saw the abuse, the gaslighting, the absolute arrogance of an alpha who thought he could surgically alter a soul for his own convenience. Orion looked up, his green eyes flashing with a terrifying, absolute malice. So, I bribed the doctor with Vance's own money. I paid him to fake the surgical scars and alter the medical records. And then, I came back here. You've been faking the lobotomy? Noah breathed out, his mind reeling, trying to process the impossibility of the situation. This whole time, the blank stares, the silence. Vance wanted a quiet, obedient machine. Orion smiled, a chilling expression that did not reach his eyes. I am merely giving him exactly what he asked for. But I am making sure he chokes on it. I have systematically destroyed his sanity, his career, and his reputation without lifting a single finger in aggression. He is breaking his own mind against the wall of my silence. Noah stared at the creature inhabiting his brother's body. He should have been terrified. He should have called a priest or a scientist or run out of the room. But as he thought of Julian Vance, the man who had discarded the real Oliver like a broken toy, a dark, vengeful satisfaction began to bloom in Noah's chest. What do you want? Noah asked, his voice steadying. Orion leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, holding Noah's gaze. I want to finish the job, Orion whispered, his voice dripping with lethal intent. I want to take everything he has left. But to do that, I need you to play along, brother Noah. I need you to walk out of this room, tell those officers I am completely brain dead, and file the final papers to drag Julian into a public courtroom. I want him to confess his sins to the world. Noah looked at the confident, terrifying entity wearing his little brother's face. The sweet, babbling boy who painted sunflowers was gone forever. But the avenging angel sitting in his place was going to ensure that Julian Vance paid in blood. Noah slowly nodded. Tell me exactly what to do. End of Part 6. Part 7, The Architect of Ruin. The heavy oak door of the guest bedroom clicked open, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the tense, suffocating atmosphere of the penthouse. Julian, who was still slumped against the kitchen island, jerked his head up. His bloodshot eyes locked onto the doorway. Noah Sterling emerged first. The powerful alpha looked entirely shattered. His broad shoulders were hunched, his hands trembled at his sides, and his face was pale, streaked with fresh, agonizing tears. He played the part of the broken, grieving brother with a raw authenticity that made Julian's stomach twist into a sickening knot. Behind Noah came Ms. Gable, the psychiatric evaluator. Her complexion was ash-white, and her hands shook violently as she clutched her clipboard to her chest. She refused to look at Julian. She refused to look at anyone. The terrifying, sovereign entity wearing Oliver's face had instilled a primal, deep-rooted fear in her, compelling her to play along with the charade. Finally, Oliver stepped out. He moved with that same horrifying, frictionless glide. His posture was ramrod straight, his hands folded neatly in front of his abdomen. His green eyes were glassy, vacant, and perfectly dead. The terrifying predator Noah had just spoken to was completely submerged, leaving only the flawless, empty shell for Julian to witness. Well, one of the police officers asked, stepping forward, his hand resting on his utility belt. Ms. Gable, what is the assessment? Ms. Gable swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously toward Oliver for a fraction of a second before she stared down at her shoes. The allegations are entirely credible, she stammered, her voice trembling. The subject, Oliver Vance, is suffering from irreversible, severe psychological ablation. He is entirely devoid of higher emotional function. He is a hazard to himself if left in the care of the individual who authorized this procedure. I am recommending immediate, emergency extraction. Julian felt the floor drop out from beneath him. No, he gasped, pushing himself up, his legs shaking so violently he could barely stand. No, you can't take him. You can't. Noah stepped in front of Oliver, his alpha aura flaring, a heavy, suffocating scent of thunderstorms that forced Julian to take a step back. The judge already signed the conditional extraction order, Julian. If Gable found evidence of abuse, he leaves with me today. Right now. You are legally forbidden from coming within 500 feet of my brother until the court hearing on Monday. He is my mate. Julian screamed, a guttural, desperate sound that tore his vocal cords. He lunged forward, but the two police officers immediately intercepted him, grabbing his arms and slamming him back against the marble counter. "Stay down, Mr. Vance," the taller officer warned, his voice dripping with disgust. "Or you'll be spending the weekend in a holding cell." Julian struggled weakly against the officer's grip, tears streaming down his ruined face. He looked past them, his desperate eyes locking onto his husband. "Ollie, Oliver, please," Julian begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "Tell them you want to stay. Tell them I provide for you. You said you were satisfied with your placement. Tell them." Oliver slowly turned his head, his neck moving with mechanical precision. He looked at Julian, his expression a blank canvas of absolute apathy. "My previous directives have been overridden by local law enforcement protocols, Alpha," Oliver recited in his hollow melodic drone. "I am programmed to comply with legal authority to ensure optimal societal functioning. My relocation is necessary. I will pack my belongings in an efficient manner." Without waiting for Julian's response, Oliver turned and glided down the hallway toward the master bedroom. Julian was forced to watch, pinned against the counter, as the life he had so meticulously controlled was dismantled piece by piece. 10 minutes later, Oliver returned. He carried a single, small overnight bag. He had packed exactly 3 shirts, 3 pairs of trousers, and his basic toiletries, folded with military precision. He left behind the expensive jewelry, the designer watches, and the vibrant, paint-splattered overalls Julian had dug out of storage. He left behind everything that made him human. Noah gently placed a hand on Oliver's back. "Let's go home, Ollie." "Yes, Brother Noah." "Initiating departure," Oliver stated. As they walked toward the front door, Oliver paused. He turned around, his empty gaze sweeping over the ruined, luxurious penthouse, and finally landing on the weeping, broken Alpha pinned against the kitchen counter. "Goodbye, Julian Vance," Oliver said softly. "I hope the quiet environment you cultivated proves to be satisfactory for your continued productivity." The heavy oak doors closed with a final, echoing thud. The police officers released Julian and walked out, leaving the penthouse in absolute, deafening silence. Julian slid down the marble cabinets, collapsing onto the cold floor. He curled into a tight ball, clutching his chest as a panic attack ripped through his nervous system. The silence he had paid millions for was no longer a state of peace. It was a physical entity. It pressed against his eardrums, heavy and suffocating. Without Oliver's mechanical breathing, without the soft, rhythmic clicking of his perfectly measured footsteps, the penthouse felt like a tomb. Julian squeezed his eyes shut, and for a fleeting, agonizing moment, his shattered mind conjured a hallucination. He heard the bright, off-key sound of Oliver humming a jazz tune. He smelled the phantom scent of vanilla and burnt sugar. Julian scrambled to his feet, running into the living room, chasing the ghost. "Ollie," he gasped. But there was nothing. Just the perfectly straight black line painted on the canvas in the corner, a mocking monument to his own arrogance. Julian Vance, the man who had commanded boardrooms and built empires, fell to his knees and screamed until his voice gave out, completely alone in the dark. The media circus outside the federal courthouse on Monday morning was unprecedented. News vans lined the streets, their satellite dishes raised like metallic weapons. Hundreds of protesters stood behind police barricades, holding signs that read "Justice for Oliver" and "Alphas are not gods." The Sterling tragedy had become a national sensation, a gruesome exposition of upper-class cruelty. When Julian's black SUV pulled up to the curb, the crowd erupted into a deafening roar of boos and shouted insults. Julian stepped out of the vehicle, flanked by his new, second-rate legal team. He looked like a walking corpse. He had lost 10 pounds in 3 days. His tailored suit hung loosely on his gaunt frame, and his eyes were sunken, surrounded by deep, bruised shadows. He stared at the ground, entirely unresponsive to the flashing cameras and the vitriol being hurled at him. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The grand, wood-paneled room was packed to capacity with reporters, legal analysts, and members of the Alpha Council, who had come to watch one of their own face a spectacular downfall. Julian sat at the defense table, his hands trembling violently in his lap. He didn't look back at the gallery. He couldn't. A sudden, heavy hush fell over the room. The heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Noah Sterling walked in, his expression rigid and protective. Beside him walked Oliver. A collective gasp echoed through the gallery. The press photographers, permitted to take pictures before the judge arrived, went into a frenzy, their shutters clicking like a swarm of locusts. Oliver was dressed in a pale gray, high-collared suit. His hair was slicked back flawlessly. He walked down the center aisle with that eerie, gliding precision, staring straight ahead, completely unfazed by the hundreds of eyes boring into him. He looked like a tragic, beautiful doll that had been hollowed out and put on display. Julian's breath hitched. He stared at his husband, a desperate, pathetic hope flaring in his chest that Oliver might look at him, might show a flicker of recognition. But Oliver walked right past the defense table without a single twitch of his facial muscles and took his seat beside Noah at the plaintiff's table. "All rise," the bailiff barked. Judge Harrison, a stern, unforgiving alpha woman with decades of experience, swept into the room and took her seat at the bench. She banged her gavel, silencing the remaining whispers in the room. "This court is now in session," Judge Harrison announced, her piercing gaze sweeping over the room before landing heavily on Julian. "We are here today for the emergency injunction and civil proceedings in the matter of Sterling versus Vance. Mr. Sterling, is your legal team prepared to proceed?" Noah's lead attorney, a sharp-eyed Omega named Mr. Davis, stood up. "We are, Your Honor, and we would like to call our first witness to the stand immediately." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Your first witness? Mr. Davis, given the medical reports submitted to my chambers, are you certain your witness is competent to testify?" "Your Honor," Davis replied, his voice ringing clearly across the silent courtroom. "The defense has claimed that the procedure performed at the Serenity Institute was a mere temperament adjustment, and that the Omega is perfectly happy and functional. We believe the court needs to see this functionality firsthand. We call Oliver Vance to the stand." Julian's sleazy defense attorney immediately jumped up. "Objection, Your Honor. This is a theatrical stunt meant to prejudice the court. The witness has been diagnosed with severe cognitive ablation." "Overruled," Judge Harrison snapped. "The core of this lawsuit is the condition of the Omega. I will hear from him. Bailiff, please swear the witness in." Noah gently touched Oliver's arm. "Go ahead, Ollie." Oliver stood up. The entire courtroom held its collective breath as the Omega glided across the floor and stepped into the witness box. He stood perfectly straight, his hands resting lightly on the wooden railing. The bailiff approached with a Bible. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" Oliver did not place his hand on the book. He tilted his head, his glassy green eyes locking onto the bailiff. "I am incapable of deception, sir." Oliver's melodic, hollow voice echoed through the microphone, sending a collective shiver down the spines of everyone in the room. "Deception requires imagination, and my imagination was surgically removed on October 14th by the authorization of Alpha Julian Vance. I will recite only factual data." In the back of Julian's mind, a tiny primal instinct, the instinct of a cornered animal, screamed at him. The delivery was too perfect. The phrasing was too sharp. But Julian was too broken to see the trap closing around him. He simply buried his face in his hands, waiting for the executioner's axe to fall. And from the witness stand, looking out over the sea of horrified faces, Orion allowed the absolute faintest, microscopic ghost of a smirk to touch the corner of his lips. The stage was set, and it was time for the symphony of ruin to reach its crescendo. End of Part 7. Part 8, The Verdict of Silence. The courtroom was so quiet that the faint buzzing of the fluorescent lights overhead sounded like a swarm of angry hornets. Hundreds of eyes were glued to the witness box, where the Omega sat in perfectly motionless, terrifying serenity. Mr. Davis, the lead attorney for the Sterling family, approached the podium. He adjusted his glasses, his hands visibly shaking despite his years of experience. Looking at Oliver Vance was like looking into a beautifully crafted abyss. "State your name and your current legal status for the record, please," Mr. Davis began, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. Oliver did not lean toward the microphone. He sat with his spine perfectly straight, his hands folded in his lap. "My legal designation is Oliver Vance, formerly Oliver Sterling. I am legally bound as the Omega mate to Alpha Julian Vance." The melodic, entirely hollow tone of his voice sent a visible shudder through the jury box. Several reporters in the front row stopped typing, staring in morbid fascination. "Oliver, can you recount the events of October 11th? The day your Alpha drove you to the Serenity Institute. Davis asked gently. Affirmative, Oliver replied instantly, without taking a breath to process the memory. At 1900 hours on October 10th, I tripped on a Persian rug while carrying art supplies. I broke a Ming vase. Alpha Julian muted his conference call. He stated, I need quiet. I need a mate, not a feral child. Not a clown. I need the dignified, obedient Omega I was promised. The following morning, he placed me in his vehicle. I exhibited signs of severe distress. I wept. I begged him to let me stay. I promised I would stop painting. Alpha Julian informed me that my noise was a defect and that the clinic would fix my brain. A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the gallery. In the second row, Oliver's mother, Elena, buried her face in her husband's chest and began to sob uncontrollably. At the defense table, Julian's slick lawyer, Mr. Hayes, shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. This is hearsay and emotional manipulation. The witness is merely parroting a subjective interpretation of a marital dispute. Judge Harrison slammed her gavel down, her eyes flashing with alpha dominance. Sit down, Mr. Hayes. Your client is on trial for medical battery and extreme abuse. The witness is recounting the exact dialogue that led to said battery. Overruled. Proceed, Mr. Davis. Julian didn't look at his lawyer. He didn't look at the judge. He was staring at Oliver, his chest heaving, a cold sweat drenching the collar of his shirt. He was watching his darkest, most shameful moment being broadcast to the world, recited by the very ghost he had created. Oliver, Davis continued, his voice thick with repressed emotion. What happened when you were admitted to the Serenity Institute? I was placed in a sterile room, Oliver answered smoothly. I was sedated. When I awoke, my wrists and ankles were restrained with leather straps. Dr. Eris entered the room. He informed me that Alpha Julian Vance had paid a premium fee for the absolute tranquility package. He applied localized anesthetic to my temples. He then utilized a transcranial thermal cauterizer to sever the neural pathways connecting my amygdala and prefrontal cortex. The courtroom erupted into a chaotic murmur. Reporters furiously typed on their laptops. The Alpha Council members sitting in the VIP section exchanged looks of profound disgust. Objection, Hayes yelled, his face turning red. The witness is not a medical professional. He cannot testify to the specifics of a surgical procedure. Your Honor, Davis fired back, pointing at Oliver. The witness is not testifying as a doctor. He is testifying as the victim who was strapped to a table while his brain was burned. I said overruled, Mr. Hayes, Judge Harrison growled, leaning over her bench. If you interrupt this testimony again, I will hold you in contempt. Mr. Davis, ask your next question. Davis took a deep breath, walking closer to the witness box. Oliver, did the procedure hurt? Oliver blinked once. A slow, terrifyingly robotic blink. During the cauterization, I experienced a pain level of 9.8 on the standard medical scale. I screamed for exactly 4 minutes and 12 seconds. After the neural bridges were successfully severed, the pain ceased. The fear ceased. Everything ceased. I am now functioning exactly as Alpha Julian requested. I am quiet. Julian broke. The dam that had been holding back his shattered sanity finally completely gave way. He couldn't listen to it anymore. He couldn't sit in this room and watch the world dissect the corpse of his marriage. Stop, Julian shrieked, his voice tearing through the courtroom like a jagged piece of metal. He shoved his chair back so violently it crashed to the floor. Please God, just stop. The bailiffs immediately reached for their weapons, but Julian didn't move toward the judge or the witness box. He collapsed to his knees right there behind the defense table, grabbing his own hair, sobbing hysterically. Mr. Vance, control yourself, the judge barked, banging her gavel. I did it. Julian screamed, rocking back and forth on his knees, completely ignoring the judge, his lawyers, and the flashing cameras. I did it. I paid them. I hated how loud he was. I hated the messes. I just wanted to work in peace. I'm a monster. I killed him. The courtroom descended into absolute pandemonium. The press shouted questions, the gallery screamed insults, and Julian's lawyers desperately tried to pull their client off the floor. Through it all, Oliver sat in the witness box. He did not flinch at the shouting. He did not look at his weeping Alpha. He simply stared straight ahead, a perfect, porcelain statue amidst a raging hurricane. But Noah Sterling, sitting at the plaintiff's table, was watching Oliver very closely. And for a fraction of a second, Noah saw it. He saw the microscopic tightening of Oliver's jaw. He saw the cold, dark satisfaction burning behind the glassy green eyes. Orion was watching the architect of his host's destruction tear himself to pieces on live television, and he was savoring every single second of it. Order! Order in this court! Judge Harrison roared, her alpha pheromones flooding the room, forcing a heavy, suffocating submission over the crowd. The shouting slowly died down, leaving only the sound of Julian Vance's broken, pathetic weeping. The judge looked down at Julian with an expression of unadulterated contempt. She turned her gaze to Julian's lead attorney. Mr. Hayes, in light of your client's spontaneous and very public confession on the record, do you have any further defense to present against the emergency injunction? Hayes was pale and sweating. He looked at Julian, who was curled in a fetal position on the floor, and then looked back at the judge. No, Your Honor. The defense rests. Judge Harrison nodded curtly. She adjusted her robes, her face set in stone. I have presided over family law and Omega rights cases for 22 years, the judge began, her voice echoing in the dead silent room. I have seen neglect. I have seen cruelty. But I have never, in my entire career, witnessed an act of such cold, calculated barbarism as what has been presented in this courtroom today. She glared at Julian, who was trembling on the floor. Julian Vance, you viewed your mate not as a partner, but as an appliance. When that appliance became inconvenient for your lifestyle, you paid an obscene amount of money to have his humanity surgically extracted. You did not just violate his bodily autonomy, you committed a profound crime against his soul. The judge picked up her pen, signing the thick stack of documents in front of her with aggressive, heavy strokes. I am granting the emergency injunction in its entirety. The mating bond between Julian Vance and Oliver Vance is hereby annulled, effective immediately. Mr. Vance, you are stripped of all marital and proxy rights. Full medical and legal guardianship of Oliver is transferred to his brother, Noah Sterling. Elena Sterling let out a cry of relief, burying her face in her hands. Furthermore, Judge Harrison continued, her voice dropping to a dangerous register, I am issuing a permanent, lifetime restraining order against Julian Vance. You are not to come within 1,000 yards of Oliver Sterling. If you attempt to contact him, approach him, or communicate with him in any capacity, you will be jailed without bail. Finally, I am forwarding the transcripts of this hearing, along with your public confession, to the federal prosecutor's office with a strong recommendation for immediate criminal indictment on charges of aggravated medical battery and human rights violations. She slammed her gavel down. The sound echoed like the final nail being driven into a coffin. This court is adjourned. The gallery erupted. The bailiffs moved in to escort Julian out of the courtroom. As they hauled the sobbing, broken Alpha to his feet, Noah walked over to the witness box. Come on, Ollie, Noah said softly, extending his hand. It's over. We're going home. Oliver stood up. He walked down the steps of the witness box, his face a perfect mask of emptiness. As he glided down the aisle toward the exit, his path intersected with Julian, who was being dragged away by the bailiffs. Julian looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, his face swollen and wet with tears. Ollie, he choked out, reaching a trembling, handcuffed hand toward his former mate. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Oliver stopped. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. He slowly turned his head to look at the shattered Alpha. His glassy, empty eyes locked onto Julian's desperate ones. An apology is a social construct utilized to repair emotional bonds, Oliver stated in his flat, hollow melody. As I possess no emotional bonds, your apology is fundamentally useless. Please ensure your future environments remain adequately quiet, Mr. Vance. Julian let out a gut-wrenching wail as the bailiffs dragged him through the side doors, his screams echoing down the marble hallways of the courthouse until they finally faded into nothing. Oliver turned back around and walked out of the double doors, stepping into the bright sunlight of the city with Noah by his side. The flashes of the press cameras illuminated his flawless, porcelain face. The tragedy of Julian Vance was complete. But for the ancient, vengeful ghost hiding behind the glassy green eyes of the broken Omega, the real work was just beginning. End of Part 8. Part 9, The Ashes of Serenity. The Sterling estate was a sanctuary of warmth, woven with the rich, comforting scents of cinnamon, roasting firewood, and the deep, protective cedar and earth pheromones of an alpha family that cherished its own. It was a home built on laughter, loud debates over Sunday dinners, and the unconditional love that Julian Vance had found so abhorrent. But for the past 5 days, since the dramatic annulment in federal court, a heavy, suffocating shroud of grief had settled over the sprawling stone manor. In the sunlit kitchen, Elena Sterling stood at the marble counter, her hands trembling as she sliced a freshly baked apple pie. It was Oliver's favorite. Before the clinic, the mere smell of it baking would have summoned her youngest son from anywhere in the house, babbling excitedly about how the cinnamon reminded him of autumn leaves. Now, Oliver sat at the rustic wooden dining table. He was dressed in a soft, oversized cashmere sweater, sitting with a posture so rigidly perfect it looked painful. His hands were folded on his lap. He was staring unblinkingly at the grain of the wood. Elena placed a warm slice of pie in front of him, forcing a bright, wavering smile. "Here you go, sweetheart. Fresh out of the oven. Just the way you like it." Oliver slowly turned his head, the movement executing with the terrifying, frictionless glide of a machine. He looked at the pie, then at his mother. "Thank you, Mother," Oliver recited, his voice a flat, melodic drone completely devoid of warmth. "My caloric intake for this period is currently sufficient, but I will consume this nutritional offering to comply with your social directive." Elena let out a stifled sob, pressing her hand over her mouth. She turned away quickly, fleeing into the pantry so her son wouldn't see her break down. Noah, who had been leaning against the doorframe watching the interaction, felt a complex knot of agony and dark, a twist in his chest. He waited until his mother's sobs were muffled behind the pantry door before walking over to the table. He tapped the wood twice. "My office, Ollie." "Now," Noah commanded softly. Oliver immediately stood up. "Yes, brother Noah. I am following." Noah led the way down the long, carpeted hallway to his private study. It was a heavy, masculine room filled with law books, leather armchairs, and the scent of aged whiskey. Noah closed the heavy oak doors, locked the deadbolt, and flipped a switch that activated a high-end acoustic dampener he used for sensitive legal client meetings. The room was now entirely soundproof. "Clear," Noah said, leaning back against the door. The transformation was instantaneous, and it never failed to send a shiver down Noah's spine. The robotic rigidity vanished from Oliver's shoulders. The terrifying, vacant stare dissolved, replaced by a sharp, predatory brilliance that burned with ancient intelligence. The Omega let out a long, very human sigh, rolling his shoulders to work out the stiff cramps of playing a mannequin all morning. He walked over to Noah's liquor cabinet with a fluid, arrogant grace that the original Oliver had never possessed, pouring himself a generous measure of scotch. "Playing the lobotomized victim is exhausting work," Orion murmured, taking a sip of the amber liquid. His voice had dropped an octave, losing its melodic hollowness, replaced by the smooth, commanding baritone of a sovereign. "Your mother's grief is regrettable, but the facade must be maintained. If the authorities, or the Vance family lawyers, suspect for a fraction of a second that I am cognizant, the entire legal victory unravels." Noah walked over to his desk, running a hand through his hair. I know it's necessary. But seeing her cry over you like you're dead, it's hard, Orion. Julian is ruined. He's sitting in a federal holding cell awaiting trial. His company is in his brother's hands, and he's facing 20 years in prison. You won. Can't we slowly rehabilitate you now? Claim it was a miracle recovery." Orion turned around, leaning against the mahogany cabinet, the crystal glass catching the light of the fireplace. He looked at Noah with a cold, unforgiving smile. Julian Vance was merely a pawn, Noah. A wealthy, arrogant pawn. But he was not the architect of the weapon that killed your brother. Orion set the glass down, his green eyes flashing dangerously. The Serenity Institute is still operating. Dr. Eris is still breathing. As long as that clinic exists, as long as they can take vibrant, chaotic souls and burn them into silent, obedient machines for the highest bidder, my victory is incomplete. Noah frowned, his legal mind immediately kicking into gear. We filed the civil suit against the Institute. The federal prosecutors have opened an investigation based on Julian's confession. They are going to be subpoenaed, Orion. Subpoenas mean nothing to monsters with deep pockets, Orion scoffed, stepping closer to the desk. Do you think a clinic that specializes in illegal neurocauterization leaves a paper trail for the feds to find? By the time the prosecutors secure a warrant, Dr. Eris will have wiped the servers, incinerated the physical files, and relocated the entire operation offshore. They will claim Julian Vance is a grieving, delusional alpha making false accusations. They will slip away. Then what do you suggest? Noah asked, crossing his arms. I'm a lawyer. I fight in courtrooms. And I am a tactician, Orion replied softly, a terrifyingly dark aura bleeding into the room. I fight in the shadows. Before I was forced into this body, I commanded empires. I know how fortresses fall, Noah. They fall from the inside. Orion walked around the desk, pulling a blank notepad and a pen from Noah's organizer. He began to write rapidly, his handwriting sharp, elegant, and entirely different from the messy, artistic scrawl the old Oliver used to have. When Julian left me in that sterile room for 3 weeks, Orion explained, not looking up from the paper, they assumed I was a compliant, broken Omega. They left me unattended in diagnostic rooms for hours while the machines supposedly scrambled my brain. But a true sovereign assesses his prison. I watched them input their security credentials. I mapped the clinic's internal network layout. I observed the shift rotations of the armed guards and the biometric bypass codes for the subterranean server room. Noah stared at the Omega, his jaw slightly slack. You memorized the security infrastructure of a multi-million-dollar illegal medical facility while pretending to be brain-dead? Orion stopped writing and slid the notepad across the desk. It was filled with strings of complex alphanumeric passwords, IP addresses, and detailed schematics. I have a perfect eidetic memory, a remnant of my past life. This is the master administrative login for their encrypted offshore server. It is where they keep the unredacted patient files, the illegal surgical logs, and the financial records of every wealthy alpha who paid them to murder their mate's personality. Noah picked up the notepad, his hands trembling as he realized what he was holding. This wasn't just evidence. This was a nuclear bomb. If this data were exposed, it wouldn't just bring down Dr. Eris. It would destroy hundreds of powerful, corrupt elites across the country. You can't just hand this to the feds, Orion warned, his voice deadly serious. There are likely judges and politicians on that client list. If you go through official channels, this evidence will vanish into an evidence locker and never see the light of day. We bypass the system entirely. How? Noah asked, his heart hammering against his ribs. You leak it, Orion commanded. You send this encrypted packet to the largest, most aggressive investigative journalism outlets in the world. You send it to Omega rights extremist groups. You blast it across the dark web simultaneously. You make the truth so loud, so universally visible, that no amount of money or political influence can suppress it. Noah looked at the chillingly calm entity wearing his brother's face. He realized that Orion was not just seeking vengeance for Oliver. He was waging a holy war against an entire system of oppression. I'll do it, Noah whispered, carefully folding the paper and placing it into his inner jacket pocket. I have contacts in independent media. I can set up a secure, untraceable data dump by midnight. Orion smiled, a genuine, terrifying expression of triumph. Good. When the sun rises tomorrow, the Serenity Institute will burn. And there will be nowhere left for the roaches to hide. Miles away, in the subterranean depths of the Federal Detention Center, the silence was absolute. Julian Vance sat on the edge of a stiff metal cot, his hands resting limply between his knees. He was dressed in a sterile orange jumpsuit, a far cry from the bespoke Italian suits that used to be his armor. The small, concrete cell was devoid of color, devoid of texture, and completely devoid of noise. It was the ultimate manifestation of the quiet life he had sacrificed everything to achieve. The heavy steel door was soundproofed. The fluorescent light buzzed faintly, a maddening, relentless drone. Julian stared at the gray concrete wall opposite him, his eyes sunken and bloodshot from days of weeping. His throat was raw. He had screamed for Oliver until he started coughing up blood, but nobody had come. I am currently awaiting my next directive, Alpha. The hollow, melodic voice echoed in Julian's mind, a phantom auditory hallucination that refused to fade. Julian flinched, covering his ears with his hands, squeezing his eyes shut. But the memory shifted. Suddenly, it wasn't the robotic drone. It was the sound of a bright, breathless laugh. It was the smell of vanilla and burnt sugar. It was the memory of Oliver, covered in blue paint, spinning Julian around the living room to a scratchy jazz record. Look, Julian. I painted the sky. I painted it just for us. Julian let out a ragged, agonizing sob, curling into a tight ball on the cold concrete floor. He dug his nails into his own scalp, desperately trying to scrape the memories out of his brain. He wanted the clinic to take him. He He wanted Dr. Eris to strap him down and burn the memories away, because the guilt was a living, breathing creature tearing at his internal organs. "I'm sorry," Julian whispered to the empty, silent room, his tears pooling on the gray floor. "I'm so sorry, Ollie. Please, just make it loud again. I want the noise back. Please, God, give me the noise back." But the concrete cell offered no forgiveness. It offered only the absolute, deafening perfection of total silence. Julian Vance was entirely alone in the graveyard he had built, and he would remain there, haunted by the ghost of the boy he had destroyed, for the rest of his miserable life. And as Julian wept in the dark, the digital clock on the wall silently ticked closer to midnight. End of Part 9. Part 10, The Sovereign's Checkmate. At exactly 11:59 p.m., the digital landscape of the world held its breath. Inside the soundproof study of the Sterling estate, the only illumination came from the harsh, blue glare of Noah's dual monitors. Noah's fingers hovered over the keyboard. His heart hammered a frantic, heavy rhythm against his ribs, his alpha pheromones spiking with a mixture of terror and absolute, righteous adrenaline. Standing behind him, completely submerged in the shadows, was Orion. The entity wearing Oliver's face watched the glowing screen with the cold, calculating stillness of a sniper about to pull the trigger. "The routing nodes are secure," Noah whispered, his voice hoarse. "I've bypassed the standard firewalls. This packet is going simultaneously to the New York Times, the Global Investigative Consortium, every major Omega advocacy group, and thousands of decentralized servers on the dark web. Once I hit enter, there is no kill switch. The Serenity Institute's entire history, every patient, every illegal surgery, every wire transfer, will be public domain." "Do it," Orion commanded, his baritone voice vibrating with lethal authority. "Burn them out of their hollows." Noah closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and slammed his finger down on the enter key. The progress bar on the screen flashed green. 100%. Data transmitted. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence in the room remained unbroken. But in the digital realm, a nuclear bomb had just detonated. It started as a trickle on underground forums, tech whistleblowers frantically decoding the encrypted files. Within 20 minutes, it became a flood. By 1 a.m., the first mainstream news alert flashed across the globe. By 2 a.m., the internet was effectively paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the scandal. The leaked documents didn't just expose Dr. Eris and Julian Vance. They implicated senators, tech billionaires, and revered Alpha Council members who had secretly paid millions to have their unruly Omega mates chemically and surgically lobotomized to ensure domestic tranquility. Orion stepped forward, resting a hand on Noah's shoulder. It was a firm, steadying grip, a gesture of comradeship forged in the fires of vengeance. "The fortress is breached, brother Noah," Orion murmured, a dark, victorious smirk playing on his lips. "Now, we let the wolves tear them apart." 300 miles away, hidden deep within a heavily forested mountain range, the Serenity Institute was thrust into absolute chaos. Dr. Eris, wearing a silk dressing gown, sprinted down the pristine, white-tiled corridors of the clinic, his face entirely drained of blood. The emergency klaxons were blaring, bathing the sterile walls in a rhythmic, apocalyptic red light. His phone had not stopped vibrating for an hour. His offshore accounts were already being frozen by international authorities. "Burn the physical files." Eris screamed at a group of panicked, scrambling technicians. "Wipe the local servers. Initiate the localized EMP in the sublevels, now." "Doctor, we can't," a beta nurse cried, her hands trembling as she held up a tablet. "The bypass codes have been locked out. Someone changed the master administrative privileges. The network is totally unresponsive." Eris stopped dead in his tracks, a cold dread washing over him. The system hadn't just been hacked from the outside. It had been hijacked from within. Before Eris could process the impossibility of the situation, the sound of heavy rotor blades chopped through the night air. The glass skylights of the atrium vibrated violently. Armed tactical teams, accompanied by federal prosecutors and furious Omega rights activists who had mobilized at lightning speed, were swarming the compound. The heavy reinforced doors of the clinic were blown off their hinges with a deafening explosion. Smoke poured into the lobby, followed by dozens of heavily armored federal agents. "FBI, get on the ground. Do not move." Eris stumbled backward, raising his hands, his arrogant, clinical demeanor entirely shattered. As he was slammed onto the marble floor and heavy steel cuffs were ratcheted around his wrists, He looked up and saw a federal prosecutor holding a printed dossier. The cover page bore the name Oliver Vance. Eris realized, with a sickening jolt of horror, that the quiet, broken Omega he had supposedly cauterized weeks ago hadn't been a victim at all. He had been a Trojan horse. A month passed. The fallout from the Serenity leak reshaped society. Legislation protecting Omega autonomy was fast-tracked through the government. The Alpha Council was dismantled, its most prominent members facing decades in federal prison. Julian Vance was one of them. The federal penitentiary was a sprawling, brutalist concrete fortress. Julian sat in the visiting room, separated from the outside world by a thick pane of bulletproof acrylic glass. He looked entirely unrecognizable. His hair was thinning, his skin was a sickly gray, and his eyes were wide, twitchy, and haunted. The silence of solitary confinement had hollowed him out, leaving only a paranoid, trembling husk of a man. The heavy metal door on the visitor's side clicked open. Julian's breath caught in his throat. He leaned forward, pressing his palms against the glass, his heart hammering against his ribs. Oliver walked into the room. He was dressed in a soft, cream-colored turtleneck and tailored slacks. He looked healthy, ethereal, and breathtakingly beautiful. He walked with that same, terrifyingly measured glide, his face a perfect, blank mask of emptiness. He sat down on the metal stool opposite Julian and picked up the black telephone receiver. Julian fumbled with his own receiver, pressing it to his ear with shaking hands. Tears instantly spilled over his eyelashes. "Ollie," Julian choked out, his voice cracking, desperate for the sound of his mate. "You came. You actually came." Oliver stared straight ahead, his glassy green eyes fixed on Julian's collarbone. "Good afternoon, inmate Vance. Brother Noah authorized a 15-minute visitation window to finalize the transfer of the Vance Tower deeds. I am here as a proxy courier." Julian squeezed his eyes shut, a sob tearing through his chest. "I don't care about the deeds. Take the tower. Take the money. I needed to see you. I'm dying in here, Ollie. The silence is killing me. It's so quiet. It never stops being quiet." "You requested a quiet environment," Oliver recited in his melodic, hollow drone. "The federal penal system provides a highly structured and silent protocol. Is the outcome not mathematically satisfactory?" "I was wrong," Julian screamed, slamming his fist against the glass, making the guard in the corner step forward. Julian quickly lowered his hands, pressing his forehead against the cold acrylic. "I was an arrogant, stupid monster. I destroyed the most beautiful thing in the world because I was too weak to handle your light. I'm sorry. I know you can't forgive me. I know you can't feel anything. But I have to say it. I love you, Oliver. I always did." Oliver sat perfectly still, absorbing the desperate, pathetic confession of the broken Alpha. The digital timer on the wall flashed, indicating 1 minute left in the visitation. Slowly, deliberately, Oliver raised his head. He looked directly into Julian's eyes. And then the mask shattered. The glassy, vacant emptiness in the Omega's green eyes instantly evaporated. They ignited with a sharp, ancient, and terrifyingly lucid fire. A slow, chilling smile carved its way across his lips, a smile dripping with sovereign arrogance, absolute malice, and triumphant vengeance. Julian froze. The breath was knocked out of his lungs. He stared at the face of his husband, but the entity looking back at him was not the broken, lobotomized doll, nor was it the sweet, babbling boy he had married. It was a predator looking at its trapped prey. Oliver leaned closer to the glass. When he spoke into the receiver, his voice was no longer flat and melodic. It was a dark, raspy, commanding baritone that sent a spike of pure, unadulterated terror through Julian's veins. "You didn't destroy him, Julian," Orion whispered, his voice dripping with lethal satisfaction. "I did. The moment you locked that clinic door, his soul shattered. I just took the wheel of the empty car you left behind." Julian's eyes widened to impossible proportions. The phone slipped slightly from his sweaty grip. What? You're in there? You're awake." "Oh, I am wide awake," Orion smiled, his green eyes flashing. "I drove you insane. I orchestrated the leak. I burned your empire to the ground, and I used the absolute silence you begged for to do it. You wanted a machine, Julian. I gave you a weapon." "No," Julian gasped, shaking his head frantically, his mind fracturing completely. No, Oliver, please." "Oliver is gone," Orion interrupted, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "And you are going to spend the rest of your pathetic life in this concrete box, knowing that you handed the keys to your destruction directly to a ghost. Enjoy the silence, Alpha. Orion hung up the phone. He stood up, his posture shifting instantly back to the rigid, robotic stance of the empty Omega. He turned and glided out of the visitation room without a single backward glance, the heavy metal door slamming shut behind him. On the other side of the glass, Julian Vance dropped the receiver. He fell out of his chair, collapsing onto the floor of the visitation booth. He began to scream. It was a guttural, mind-shattering sound of a man who had finally, completely lost his sanity. He screamed until the guards rushed in to sedate him, his cries echoing down the sterile, concrete hallways of the prison. The late afternoon sun bathed the Sterling estate in a warm, golden glow. In the sunroom, overlooking the sprawling gardens, an easel was set up. It hadn't been touched in months, but today, a canvas rested upon it. Orion stood before the canvas, holding a palette of vibrant oil paints. He wasn't wearing the stiff, robotic suits anymore. He wore a loose, comfortable linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He dipped a brush into a deep, rich cerulean blue and pressed it to the canvas. He did not paint with the chaotic, erratic frenzy of the old Oliver. He painted with the precise, deliberate, and masterful strokes of a sovereign who understood the structure of beauty. He was painting an empire, a sprawling, majestic landscape of mountains and starlit skies. Noah leaned against the doorframe of the sunroom, watching in silence. To the rest of the world, and to Elias and Elena, the story was a miracle. They believed that Oliver was slowly healing, that the trauma was receding, and that fragments of his old self were returning through intensive therapy. Orion played the part flawlessly, occasionally allowing a soft smile or a gentle word to comfort the grieving parents, slowly blending his own identity with the ghost of the boy who had once loved them. But Noah knew the truth. He knew the sweet, chaotic boy was gone. But as he watched Orion paint, watching the entity meticulously care for the body and the family he had inherited, Noah realized he didn't care. Orion had avenged Oliver. Orion had saved thousands of others. And in his own dark, imperious way, Orion was fiercely protective of the Sterling clan. Orion paused, setting the brush down. He turned his head, his sharp green eyes meeting Noah's. "The composition is nearly complete," Orion said, his voice calm, carrying the smooth cadence of a king at peace. "It lacks a certain warmth, however. The old host preferred yellow. Sunflowers, I believe." Noah smiled, a genuine, tired, but peaceful smile. He walked into the room, picking up a tube of golden yellow paint and handing it to Orion. "He did," Noah said softly. "He always said yellow was the color of survival." Orion took the tube, examining it carefully. A faint, almost imperceptible softness touched the corners of his mouth. "Survival," he echoed. "A fitting addition, then. To outlive the monsters." Orion squeezed a drop of golden paint onto the palette. Together, in the quiet warmth of the sunroom, the Alpha and the transmigrated Omega stood side by side, painting the dawn of a new, unbroken world. The silence in the room was no longer a weapon, nor was it a tomb. It was finally peace. End of story. Wow, just wow. Let's all just take a collective deep breath after that one. What a journey. From the vibrant, messy colors of Oliver's original soul to the terrifying, weaponized silence of Orion's revenge. This story was an absolute emotional roller coaster, and I am so glad we got to experience it together. Thank you so much for staying with me all the way to the end of this incredible 10-part saga. Let's really break this down for a second, because there is so much to unpack here. First, we have to talk about Julian. Julian Vance is the ultimate cautionary tale of what happens when you treat a relationship like a business transaction. He didn't want a partner, he wanted a possession. He was so obsessed with his own comfort, his own perfect, quiet world, that he was willing to burn his mate's soul to ashes to get it. And the poetic justice of this story? The universe gave Julian exactly what he asked for. Orion didn't lay a single finger on Julian. He simply handed Julian the absolute, deafening silence he begged for, and let him drown in it. It's a brilliant reminder that sometimes the worst punishment you can give a toxic person is to simply give them exactly what they want and watch it destroy them. And then there's Orion. Oh my gosh, Orion. Can we just take a moment to appreciate the absolute mastermind that he is? The original Oliver was too pure, too sweet for the cruel world Julian dragged him into, and it broke my heart when we realized his original soul couldn't survive the betrayal. But Orion? Orion stepped into that empty vessel and became an avenging angel. He played the long game perfectly. He didn't just avenge Oliver. He brought down an entire corrupt system, dismantled the Alpha Council, and exposed the Serenity Institute, all while pretending to be a broken doll. It was chilling, it was brilliant, and it was so satisfying to watch. But now, I want to hear from you guys. I have a few questions for you, and I want you to flood the comment section with your thoughts. First question, did you feel even a tiny shred of pity for Julian at the very end in that prison cell, or do you think he got exactly what he deserved? Second question, at what point do you think Noah actually realized that his brother was truly gone? Do you think he suspected it before Orion finally revealed himself in the guest room? And lastly, what was your absolute favorite moment of Orion's revenge? For me, it was that terrifying smile in the dark when Julian woke up in the middle of the night. Pure goosebumps. Let me know all your theories and thoughts down in the comments below. I read every single one of them, and I love talking with you guys. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, please do me a huge favor and smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on our upcoming stories. We have so many more amazing, thrilling, and romantic BL audio stories coming your way, and you definitely want to be here for them. Thank you again for watching, for commenting, and for being such an amazing community. This is your BL boyfriend, signing off. Remember, never let anyone silence your beautiful noise. Stay colorful, stay loud, and I'll see you in the next video.